Welcome. Happy Wednesday, everyone. I'm Angela Seifer. I'm the Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. This is our third in our webinar series, Net Inclusion. They have been incredibly fabulous so far, so we're very excited to continue that with today's webinar. NDIA has been around about 7 years. We got started because there wasn't an entity representing digital inclusion programs on the ground, so that's what we do. We hear from folks on the ground, we help them talk to each other, that whole peer-to-peer kind of idea. Lots of resources on our website. We have an active listserv, all of that. So if you are not a member of our community, I welcome you to join. We also do the advocacy work that is necessary for the folks on the ground to have the resources that they need and the support they need to do that work that is so essential. So this webinar series is our replacement for our in-person conference. We were supposed to be in Portland 2 years ago, and we will still be in Portland in 2022. And so that save the date is actually coming out today. So watch the website for that and the notice of that on our listserv. Also important to know the way that we structure these is it's very interactive among our panelists. We love the Q&A, so make sure you put your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. They could get lost in the chat, but do talk to each other in the chat. NDIA is a community. And so this is one of those places where we can help foster that since it's harder for all of us to be in person right now. The way we structure it then is that you're going to get the majority of the content in that first hour. There will be some Q&A probably in that first hour, but we're not going to get to it because there's always too many questions to cover within that hour. And so our panelists have generously agreed to stick around for an extra 30 minutes so we can cover some additional questions. And so that hour plus will all be recorded and put on the website. But if you have to leave us in an hour, know that you've gotten the big chunk of the information. Okay, so we have Amalia Deloney as our moderator, and she's a master moderator, and that always very much excites me because then it keeps the conversation like boom, boom, boom. And you will see that today with this master moderator. So Amalia, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, welcome and no pressure at all. Thank you. But incredibly excited to be with everyone today. As Angela said, my name is Amalia Deloney, and I'm now with the Robert W. Deutsch Foundation. Today's conversation is really exciting because I'm joined by incredible practitioners, thought partners, advocates, researchers. And what we'd like to do over the next hour and a half is really demonstrate sort of the dynamism that's taking place in the field as we raise questions and sort of engage in creative antagonism around what are the lessons learned about digital equity planning, coalitions, what has worked, what hasn't worked, what do we need more of? What shouldn't we repeat? And as we come out of COVID, what are kind of the big new thinking, kind of big new thoughts and formats that we could be exploring? So today we have 4 incredible speakers. We have Sharon Navas, who's the co-founder and executive director of the Equity in Education Coalition. Colin Rhinesmith, expert researcher and associate professor and director of community informatics at the lab at Simmons University. Kurt Williams, who's the digital innovation fellow at Cleveland Foundation. And finally, Aaron Schill, director of data mapping at the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. So welcome everyone. In order that I just named you all, I'd like to invite you to introduce yourself to the NDIA family today. Share a little bit about who you are, your organization, and your relationship to digital equity, whether it's coalitions, planning, or research. And then talk to us a little bit just on the front end about how you've been entering this space. Like, where is your connection point for the conversation today? And Sharon, if you'd kick us off.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Sharon Navas, she, her, Sharon. I'm the co-founder of the Equity in Education Coalition. We are a civil rights organization that's statewide in Washington. We look at closing the opportunity gap for kids of color, Indigenous, and Black students. We entered the digital equity space almost exactly a year ago today. Washington State, for those of you that have not been living in the dumpster fire that was 2020, was the ground zero for the coronavirus back then, now COVID-19. We had some of the first cases here, and we shut down the state on March 15th of 2020, which means that we were not anticipating having to deal with 1.3 million students having to suddenly go to remote learning, about 900,000 elders and seniors having to learn how to get online, use the internet, use their phones, and remote work for a good portion of our workforce. So we entered the space because of a concern that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who are essential workers but weren't necessarily considered essential workers in the first round of conversations around the coronavirus would have to figure out how to get into work, go to school, stay connected to their families. Again, because we were ground zero, we were also one of the first states to have to figure out telehealth for pretty much the whole state. So we, because of our focus on racial justice and social equity, we were invited to have one of the first conversations around how we're going to ensure that everyone has access to the internet, broadband, and hardware.
Thank you. Colin.
Thanks, Malia, and hello, everyone. It's great to be with you all. So my name is Colin Reinsmith. I use he, him pronouns. So I am a researcher. I work at Simmons University in Boston, the School of Library and Information Science. I'm also affiliated with the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society as a senior research fellow. And so I've been studying digital equity and coalitions primarily for the past 6 years, starting with my affiliation with the Benton Institute. And this work culminated in a report that was published by Benton called Digital Inclusion and Meaningful Broadband Adoption Initiatives. However, actually my first connection to this space is really as a practitioner. So 15 years ago, I started working in a public computer lab in a community media center here in Massachusetts. And that was really, I think, my entrance into this space and as part of this community before the community actually existed with NDIA. So it's been really wonderful to be a part of this particular community, both as a practitioner and as a researcher. But one of the things that I wanted to just mention briefly in terms of my experience looking at digital equity coalitions as a researcher, starting with the Benton Institute report that was published in 2016, was really just the ways in which I was impressed by, really the ecology of support that is provided by coalitions and the organizations that are part of coalitions doing this work. And not only was this, obviously, and we'll talk about it today, really became apparent during the pandemic in the last year. But what's been really fascinating for me, which I'll look forward to talking about more today, is really sort of, what was surfaced really in looking at not only the technology supports that were provided, but the human supports, essentially the social interactions and the supports that are provided that are, just as important, if not more important than the technology that's provided in the work that coalitions do. So again, I'm excited to be here and look forward to talking more about this today.
Thanks. Let's go to you, Kurt.
Thanks, Malia, and good afternoon and good morning, everybody. My name is Kurt Williams. I'm the Digital Innovation Fellow at the Cleveland Foundation. The Cleveland Foundation is Greater Cleveland's kind of community endowment. We create grants, make grants across 3 counties in Northeast Ohio, across program areas such as education, health, social services, neighborhoods. I work specifically on the Foundation's Digital Excellence Initiative, which aims to elevate Greater Cleveland's digital leadership and digital economy. And digital equity undergirds this initiative. We absolutely can't have a strong digital presence without digital equity. So through this initiative and our grant making, we naturally have to look at the systems level, bringing people together, ensuring we're filling any gaps in our digital equity ecosystem. And so we've been doing that for several years since we got into the digital equity space back in 2015, 2016. Really bringing in the organizations who are committed to this work, who are invested in this work. But that kind of blew up with the onset of the pandemic last year, and so many more organizations, as I'm sure so many people on this call and the panelists have seen, were interested and wanted to get involved. And so we expanded our informal coalition of our grant 7 or 8 grantees to almost 100 organizations in Greater Cleveland who are interested in this work. And so that's last April when we formalized our Greater Cleveland Digital Equity Coalition, and have been working since to have more coordinated impact.
Fantastic, thank you. And Aaron, last but not least.
Hello, everyone. Aaron Schill. I use the he, him pronouns, and I'm the Director of Data and Mapping at Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. So we are the regional council for the Columbus area, but we serve an area of 15 counties. So very diverse, about 2.4 million residents, and we represent about 75 local governments in Central Ohio. So that ranges from the city of Columbus with 900,000 residents to villages and townships, some of whom have about 150 residents. So a real diversity of community types and obviously needs and perspectives in our membership. Our work in digital equity, we have been hearing a growing interest and need for support from our local governments for the past several years. But I would say our work in earnest, like a lot of folks around the country, really started to pick up kind of leading up to the pandemic, and then really amplified substantially last spring. So we were having conversations. A big part of what we do at MORPC is we facilitate conversations, and we convene local governments, nonprofits, the private sector, and community partners around key issues for our region. And so kind of understanding that digital equity and broadband, both access and adoption, were concerns of our members and kind of growing conversation. We were holding a number of conversations and kind of bringing folks together and just trying to get a sense of what was going on. And then the pandemic hit, and we quickly spun up a program to provide hotspot devices and computers to K through 12 students in need, similar programs to those in many other parts of the country, and found ourselves as a program administrator and kind of direct provider, which is not usually a role we play. So we were kind of meeting this immediate need and figuring it out as we went. And some other organizations began kind of meeting and developing organic work around that. And that has since formulated into a much more formal structure that we'll get into a little bit more. But I think like a lot of folks, we were sort of dipping our toes in the water for the past year or two, and then have found ourselves in the deep end pretty quickly and are happy to be doing the work.
Thank you. So Aaron, I'm going to stick with you, and we're going to bring Sharon back into the conversation, because both of you are working in coalitions that have really existed for very different amounts of time, right? So if we think of you on a spectrum, you're in sort of different places on the spectrum. And going to you first, Sharon, can you kind of briefly share with us your coalition's history? You shared some of it already, but go a little bit deeper. And really focus, because we're talking about coalition identity now, on how you were formed, why you were formed, and walk us through how you think about your coalition. Is it an informal space? Is it a formal space? And how did you reach that definition or conclusion?
Thanks, Amalia. So the Equity and Education Coalition was born as a coalition in August of 2012. The genetic makeup of the organization is to work in collaboration and in relationship with others who believe in equity within the educational system, and also who believe and acknowledge the institutional and systemic racism that Black, Indigenous, and students of color face and have faced in this country. We know that as a collective, we're more powerful together than we are apart. That also means that there are sometimes we can't be partners with folks because we're going either in different directions or we have different priorities. When we were invited to this space by a state legislator and by Sabrina Roach a year ago, our understanding was, a year ago life was very different. We were told that the quarantine was only going to last a couple of months, so the hope was that we were going to finish out the year, and then the summer was going to hit and the virus was going to go away, and it was just going to be a blip on the radar. And then suddenly that blip got really long, and it just became like an ongoing issue. So for us, it was really important to not only understand the issues around digital equity, but also understand that as an organization ourselves, we can't solve it all, and we're not very good at solving it all. There are levels of expertise that everyone brings to the table that we obviously are not going to be able to fill. So with Sabrina's, with NDIA and Sabrina and other folks, we've been able to form a coalition that we named Connect Washington Coalition. The goal is to get 100% of Washington residents connected to broadband or internet, because Washington State, as many states in the Union, we have two very different geographies. We have the west side of the state and the east side of the state. The west side is home to Seattle, Tacoma, and Olympia, which is the state capital. So we get a lot of notice when it comes to the state issues. The east side, however, is a little bit more rural. It has a lot of farmland. So some of the issues that come up there are not always noticed by this region. And we know that representation matters. As an organization led by and staffed by 100% Black, Indigenous, and people of color, we recognize and acknowledge that representation matters. So a coalition is just a natural way of us leading the work. And it is a formal coalition. So we have a steering committee, we have subcommittees, any funding that we get goes to our coalition members.
Thank you. And how about you, Aaron?
Yeah, so our coalition is much newer. We began meeting, did not start as a coalition. There was a collection of anchor institutions, the leaders of whom began meeting a little over a year ago, kind of in response to various requests and ways that their organizations were meeting the needs of the community around broadband and digital equity. We knew that there was a lot going on in our community, but no one was really talking to each other, and there was no sense for how these efforts were or were not overlapping or coordinating with one another. So in addition to MORPC, the City of Columbus, the Columbus Foundation, our community foundation, Columbus Metropolitan Libraries, Ohio State, kind of these key anchor institutions that had reasons to be engaged in this work, started meeting every Wednesday morning at 8 a.m. And it developed organically over the next several months and kind of continued to grow by word of mouth and someone inviting someone else to the table until we had, by last fall, we had 20 or so organizations represented and on average 40 or so people attending these meetings. And as we kind of moved out of the triage mindset and kind of thinking about how do we work on emergency response and started thinking about the capacity we had built in this group, still having, to this day, still having the president of our community foundation, the president of the library, my executive director, all of these kind of key community leaders attending, someone named Angela, who happens to run a National Digital Inclusion Alliance, but live in Central Ohio. We had all of these key community leaders showing up every Wednesday morning at 8 a.m. And so we knew that there was something there, and we knew that there was capacity that had been built in this informal structure. And so we made a very intentional decision to transition this to a formal coalition. So we didn't hit pause, but we took some time to think about what should this look like? How would we build sustainability into the model? And so now we do have a pretty formal coalition. We also have a steering committee that is co-chaired by myself at MORPC and someone from the library. The steering committee is made up of 9 organizations total. And then there are 4 other working groups. The chair of each working group sits on the steering committee so that there is a direct tie back to between the working groups and the broader coalition. Our coalition still meets twice a month, and our steering committee meets on the alternate Wednesdays that the coalition doesn't meet. And then the working groups kind of set their own schedules and develop their own charters from there. To kind of guide all of that, we developed a framework document that lays out 5 key priorities that we want to address. Those 5 priorities align with the working groups and our steering committee, and kind of talk about, in very broad sense, what strategies we envision taking on to address kind of the scope of digital equity needs. So the structure is pretty formal. We are still coming up with pieces as we go. We officially launched kind of internally as a coalition. We told ourselves we are no longer a working group. We are now a coalition in January of this year, and then publicly launched in March of this year. So we're I guess officially just a little over a month old as a coalition.
Great, thank you. So, now the next building block we want to discuss a little bit in kind of coalition evolution is the purpose. And so I'm going to turn to you, Colin, and you, Kurt. And I'm going to start with you, Colin, actually. We know, and I'm sure you've discovered this through your research, the importance of coalitions. And for so many coalitions, it's about bringing individuals or organizations together with the goal of some degree of joint advocacy or joint action. But even in that definition, there's still a lot of room for variety in terms of how and prioritization and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So could you, from a 5-mile level in your research, just discuss with us what you've seen across the country in terms of coalition purpose, structure, focus, priority, and then we'll turn to Kurt for some on the ground kind of practitioner insight.
Sure. So last fall, I should mention that the Benton Institute published sort of a follow-up report in some ways to the 2016 report that I mentioned earlier, called Growing Healthy Digital Equity Ecosystems During COVID-19 and Beyond. And essentially what that report focused on was looking at digital inclusion coalitions, digital equity coalitions, and their responses to the pandemic, but also getting a sense of what's ahead in terms of the future, after COVID, which we're all looking forward to. So one of the things I think that was, really striking about the report was, first of all, and I should say, actually, a number of the NDIA folks in this community participated actually in this survey. So we had about 55 responses from folks that are members of the NDIA community that identified as being part of either a formal, informal, or emerging coalition. And so that's what's been great to hear the stories so far from everyone so far about, sort of how they identify and how you all have been coming to this work and growing your work. And that very much is represented in the survey results that we found. And I think one way to talk about sort of the differences between some of the different coalitions, not only in how they identify and the groups that they are a part of or that are a part of their coalition, is thinking about their responses, right? So when I was looking at the data and the responses to the survey, I was sort of seeing very much that the groups sort of define themselves based on sort of the challenges that they had in front of them. So one way to kind of think about this is sort of groups, or the way that we thought about it was groups that formed before the pandemic and groups that formed in response to the pandemic. And I think that one of the really interesting things was that for folks that identified as being part of coalitions that formed before the pandemic, is that they really became a resource for their community in a way that, because they had already established many of the sort of foundational digital inclusion activities, which we often refer to as providing access to low-cost internet plans, to provide access to low-cost devices, digital literacy training, and then during, sort of pre-pandemic times, it was public access computing, places where folks could go to gain access to the things that I just mentioned. So the coalitions that were formed before the pandemic really talked about themselves as being the sort of resource hubs for their communities. They began to sort of organize resources and sharing those resources across communities. So for example, in Portland, Oregon, we see this amazing work that folks did there, putting together a digital inclusion action tracker, I believe is what they called it, which is just a spreadsheet, but an incredible resource for all of the different activities and work happening during the pandemic. So they really became this sort of hub, not only for action in the community, but the other piece of it was shifting to convince local policymakers about the value of their work and how important it was at that time, where we see folks that responded sort of in response, or were formed in response to the pandemic, were really focused more on these foundational aspects, right? The digital inclusion activities that I mentioned earlier. I will say, however, that those groups like yours there in Baltimore, Amalia, and in other communities, that had strong relationships started before the pandemic had reported that they had a much easier time pivoting and sort of jumping in and tapping into the networks that existed. And I think that is just such a great story in terms of the power of relationships and the ways that Sharon was talking about. We're not, not competing, but actually saying, like, how can we share resources and work together? It's incredibly important for doing this work, particularly during the pandemic. So those were some of the takeaways, and I'm happy to share some more as we go along today.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think you're so right? I mean, I think one of the through lines for good coalitions is this ethos of better together. So, Kurt, I'm going to turn to you now and just ask you to share from a more practitioner or kind of place-based perspective, what resonates with you in terms of what Colin shared, but also from your own perspective, how are you thinking about the purpose of your coalition and what that means in terms of how you've built your structure?
Yeah, definitely. So where our coalition is now, it's still fairly informal. We don't have a charter or governing documents, and we use a Google Drive and a Google site to share agendas, meeting notes, resources, information broadly with the group. But a lot of our purposes reflect a lot of what Colin just said. We share information broadly about local and national things that are going on in this space, spark connections between non-traditional partners, help introduce a digital equity lens to more organizations' work, build new solutions from the ground up when we have the resources, all to achieve coordinated impact, like you said, Amalia. And so kind of getting into the details of our structure, we have full coalition meetings with 160 or so people invited, representing education, healthcare, workforce, corporate, philanthropic, community-based advocacy organizations. And these meetings occur every other month and are mainly for reporting out of a lot of the work that's happening in our committees. And the committees meet as determined by the committee chairs, but generally every few weeks, depending on the needs of what they're working on at the time. Whereas we've seen some coalitions who've structured their committees around kind of the stool, the digital equity, digital inclusion focuses, connectivity, devices, digital skills. Our committees are structured around populations to better capture the interests of people involved, such as students, health, focusing on how people touch the healthcare system, seniors and elders, among a few others. And those involved in the committees can focus holistically on how they can get resources to that population of people or people in that domain. So while the Cleveland Foundation provides meeting invites, takes notes, generally just tries to provide staff to keep the conversation and drive actions forward, we've tried to encourage anybody who has ideas, especially contradictory ideas, to have their voice heard and get more formally involved, start leading things. We try not to be a bottleneck or develop top-down solutions. We think that the informal nature of our coalition allows people to take things and run with them when they have ideas, because most people involved are voluntarily participating on top of all of the other responsibilities that they have in their lives. And we believe that waiting for something to be approved by a steering committee or something like that would make things more difficult. We also think that a more formal structure would have forced us to be less inclusive. The informal structure allows everyone involved who wants to be at their own discretion and at their own capacity. So while we've played with the idea of the more formal structure, the informal nature of our coalition has been great in creating connections, partnerships between organizations, and has helped continue to sustain discussion in Greater Cleveland.
Thank you. So Kurt, I'm going to stay with you, but we're also going to bring Erin back into the conversation. And we're going to spend a few minutes talking about coalition membership, which in some ways I think is the spot where there's the most kind of contested terrain. And we've already seen some questions in the chat this morning, so I'll raise them now and you can answer them in the context of the question I'm going to pose. But sort of, I guess the contested terrain is really who's in and who's out and why, right? And so as you think about membership, not as sort of a separate siloed area, but membership and who belongs in your coalition as part and parcel of a political practice of what you're trying to achieve, what are the things that you guys are playing with, kind of beyond the good, bad, right, wrong binary? What are the questions that you've had to ask yourself or answer around what is a good membership profile? Does it include ISPs? Should it include private industry? Is it just nonprofit? Is it grassroots only? Just both of you, maybe starting with Aaron, share with us, kind of your public thinking about how you've determined who your coalition is for and why.
Great, yeah, great question. And very much questions that we continue to wrestle with and continue to evolve. The general mindset of MARPC is the more people at the table, the better. We don't have a lot of statutory power in most areas of our work. Our power comes from our convening and the trust that we've built in the community for being kind of that honest broker of conversations around key issues. That said, we have kind of, as a steering committee, thought through some of these questions and arrived at some things that are working well and some things that I think we want to continue thinking about. Just a couple of logistical considerations. We made the decision relatively early on to limit official coalition membership to organizations. So we are not bringing individuals in. That said, an organization can have, once an organization has joined the coalition, then any representative of that organization is welcome to sit in and join that. And we have a number of folks representing different organizations that will pop in to different meetings. We also developed and this is kind of very nuts and bolts, but we developed a quick inquiry form that anyone who is interested can fill out. They can identify if they're interested in being part of the coalition, part of any of the working groups, and then provide a little bit of background about their interest, why they're interested, and what they think they would contribute to the conversation and the work. As much as anything, that helps to take some of the burden off of our steering committee and other coalition members. So if someone asks if they want to be a part, we can just direct them there, and then it provides an opportunity for our steering committee to take a quick look and generally kind of say, yes, this makes sense. If there are questions, then it creates a mechanism for us to have some discussion about if a particular organization makes sense to join. We do have public sector, private sector, and nonprofit representatives. The one decision that we've made as a coalition that continues to get a lot of conversation is so far we have decided not to have ISPs as a member of the coalition. We have set aside separate meetings for the steering committee to meet with any interested ISPs in kind of one group conversation. The goal for those is to build some trust and build some dialogue between the steering committee and the different ISPs that are working in Central Ohio, and identify some issues that we can work on together and address. But so far, we've felt pretty good about that approach, and we'll kind of see how that develops. I think we're open to feeling that out as we go, but that's been the approach so far.
Great, thank you. Kurt?
Yeah, we were in a similar position as Aaron back last summer. We had mostly organizations involved. But then when we realized how fast we were growing and how many people were really interested in helping to develop solutions and just think about these things, we really opened it up to anybody who wanted to be. And it has been a little bit unruly sometimes, which is a good thing. It's actually a great thing sometimes. Just making sure that we're capturing all those ideas and making sure they bubble up and that we put them on paper. So because of how diverse our organization or our coalition is, one of the things that we've done is we try to have co-chairs of each of the committees from different types of organizations or different types of experiences leading. So if one co-chair represents an institutional background or has connections with larger organizations, the other should have more experience in direct service or at a community-based organization. And we found that this balance provides legitimacy and works pretty well. We also try to be as inclusive as possible. So after and during every meeting, asking if there's anybody that people know that should be involved or who are interested, let us know and we can reach out to them, not waiting until they reach out to us, because we know that there might be some hesitancy, but inviting them in and allowing them to join. We have found that we've had to limit our full coalition meetings with a lot of people involved to everybody's invited, but the people who are speaking are the people who are reporting out, who are talking about the initiatives, or are the co-chairs of the committee talking about the work that the committee is doing. And one of the things that we've been working on through kind of all of this the whole time is institutional gatekeeping. When a coalition is just a way for our foundation or for institutions to hear about the work that's going on, or developing a top-down agenda, it doesn't work. We should be helping people develop solutions, facilitating, making connections. We even considered a consultant to facilitate, to be a neutral third party. So far I've decided against it, but are still considering things like that. But we just need to continue to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to shape the ideas and make connections.
Great, thank you. So we have one more question that we're gonna tease out with just a couple people. Then we'll do a full round of answers on a second question, then open it up for questions. So I see some coming into the chat and people can feel free to put more there. I want to go now to you, Sharon and Colin, sort of close out this portion of the conversation by focusing on values, coalition values. And obviously here it's really important to elevate the framework of racial justice as a value that's central to digital equity coalitions. And so, you know, I say that because I think that we know in so many ways now that maybe everyone didn't before, that you can't truly achieve digital equity without, you know, engaging in planning and values-based work that elevates equitable futures through a racial justice lens. Right, and that means the digital equity coalitions have a role to play to advance racial justice values and challenge structural racism. Now, I think that in this space, we often hear people committed to values of racial equity and racial justice, but sort of the rigor around things like understanding and specifically challenging structural racism, understanding the role of community accountability and authentic partnerships, moving a coalition in a way or in a direction that prioritizes root causes. Those are places where I think there's still a lot of room for people to grow the muscles, increase the practice, and lean in. So I'm wondering from your perspectives, let's start with you, Sharon, you know, how have you in your work, which is clear to me, but share with everyone, why did you decide to make racial justice central and structure your coalition in such a race forward way, you know, and how does that allow you to do work in a way that's deeper and more impactful than if you hadn't?
Amalia, thank you for the question. I think, so for us as an organization, I'm the co-founder of the EEC, which is the parent organization of Connect Washington. We started with a racial equity lens. So that is the core genetic makeup of who we are as an organization. My board is 100% BIPOC. My staff is 90% BIPOC. Our advisors are folks who have lived experiences in institutional and systemic racism, ableism, sexism, all the isms of our world. We understand that there are both systemic, institutional, and policy reasons for which 18% of the largest county in Washington state by population doesn't have internet access. We're talking about 18,500 families that are within 15 to 20 minutes of Redmond, Washington, which is the home of Microsoft, that don't have internet access. Those families are predominantly ELL families, they're ESL families, they're multicultural, multilingual, they're Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian. So for us, there was no other starting point but racial equity. The value of the organization and the value of the Connect Washington Coalition is structured on the ending the institutional and systemic racism that has created the inequity of the digital divide. We know that there were, at the height of the pandemic, there were 285,000 students in Washington state that had no access to the internet because of a lack of access of laptops, hardware, broadband. 93,000 of the 285,000 were Latinx students. So that's not including the number of Latinx students that are migrant students as well, that are working on the farms, that are going from farm to farm throughout the year. 18,000 of those students are Black. 26,000 of those students are Native American. So we know that the institutional racism of all the public sectors and all the institutions of our state, all of those disseminated the digital inequity. We know that we were under the impression that Microsoft, Amazon, and Google were going to take care of us in terms of internet broadband, and that hasn't been the case. So for us, the starting point of every conversation is racial equity, and even the way we started Connect Washington was bringing in community-based organizations that work with, represent, and are led by the very communities that we're hoping to influence and work with. So the Connect Washington membership is about 80% BIPOC. They're representing poor, low income, multilingual, multicultural families that often have more assets that they bring to the table than the needs that we often are talking about. So for us, it was just a no-brainer and also a non-starter to not have racial equity be the center of our work.
Thank you. And Colin, what have you seen in your research across the country in terms of how coalitions are centering questions of racial justice, linked to digital equity? And if you have this kind of purview, where are the challenges, right? Like, where are the places where people are hitting roadblocks that are really important and essential that they wrestle with and get over?
Yeah, so I will try my best at that question. I mean, I think so. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to go deep enough in the survey that we did in the fall, and what we did ask was how coalitions see their work or new strategies that they're developing, how it connects to issues connected to racial justice and economic inequality. And, actually only 2 of the survey respondents were able to make clear connections in their very short responses to seeing racial justice as, intimately connected to their work to promote digital equity. One organization said that, they're really talking about in their coalition what it means to lead with race, right? As we continue to implement our digital equity action plan strategies. And another group said that they see strong connections between racism as a public health crisis, as a public health issue, and the lack of access to broadband. So I think we're seeing this recognition. But I think for me, in the work that I'm doing now around digital equity ecosystems and the work ahead is really to dig deeper. And because of what you're talking about, I mean, it's so fundamental to all of it in the ways that Sharon was also mentioning. One thing that fortunately digital inclusion researchers like myself have benefited from is decades of scholarship that have really pushed on issues of access, that access to technology is not enough, right? We know that simply having access is not going to solve all the problems. And as you said, Amalia, we need to look at these underlying root causes. The underlying root causes, racial injustice, economic injustice, other injustices, because of systemic inequalities and structural racism in our society being one of them. We need to connect this work, and coalitions are perhaps, better suited than others because they can look across their community and see who is working on these issues and join other people who are doing that work. And I think, just to kind of conclude here, I think not only is this the work ahead, I think for folks who care about digital equity and people on this call, but I think even at a broader policy level, at a federal level right now, where we see incredible momentum and energy around investing at a federal level in digital equity, we need to also look at those investments looking at racial justice and making connections between those two and other inequality, that to say this work is not separate, and we need to come together perhaps across agencies at a federal level, as well as a state level and local level, to say, how can we bring folks together to address and solve these problems? So I look forward to those conversations. I think people know that that's the work ahead, but it's the work that this community can really do to push it forward.
Thank you. It's such a perfect segue. And it also, highlights one of my favorite thinkers, Angela Davis, who often, encourages people to do bold and radical thinking by just thinking things through together, right? Just taking two things that seemingly feel opposite or disconnected and forcing yourself to do the critical thinking of putting them together. So I really appreciate that. So we're going to go in this order. We're going to go first Aaron, then Sharon, then Kurt, and then Colin. This will be our last question before we open it up to the audience. And Colin teed it up perfectly, right? So between the $1.9 trillion of American Rescue Plan Act money that is coming, as well as really bold amounts of earmarked money from House leaders for broadband, we're in this moment where almost unimaginable amounts of money are going to be moving across the country with the intention of improving internet and broadband access at the state and local level. So I'd love to go down the line and just have each of you share, right? How are you preparing? Like, what is your coalition doing to prepare for this moment, right? Some of that could be receiving the dollars, but I think for the listeners today, it's also what is the soil that you're tilling, so to speak, to Colin's point, to really make sure that not only can you receive and implement the dollars, but you're doing so with a vision that ties all of these equity questions together. And again, we'll start with you, Aaron.
Yeah, and I will note that it is not just the American Rescue Plan either. It's CARES Act dollars that are still available through this year. It's the Consolidated Appropriations Act and the EBB and infrastructure programs there. One of the biggest challenges we're hearing is people just don't know. They're hearing about all of these programs and they just don't know timelines and what lines up with what and who's eligible for what. So a big part of our role is just helping to kind of get stuff straight and inform people about what is out there. But as a coalition, we are developing a funding matrix where we capture all of these programs and then start aligning either known projects that our coalition members and others in the community are working on, or ideas for projects that we could start to plug in and say, with IMLS funding, library, you all can go after this to support digital literacy. MORPC, City of Columbus, and others, you can go after these funds for building infrastructure. So just trying to kind of align and create transparency among the coalition members and others in the community so that we don't feel like we're competing for dollars, but that we're attacking this as a region. One of our coalition members actually, I think, summarized it well. He said, if we look back in 5 or 10 years, we might have all gone after a lot of different funding pots and have implemented a lot of great individual programs and moved the needle in some different areas. Or we could look back and have developed a coordinated approach as a region and made substantial progress along a united front and be substantially farther ahead than we would probably even have envisioned a year or so ago. So that's the approach. And then the last piece is we are looking at either asking one of the coalition members to reserve one of their staff members for a kind of limited period of time, or hiring a consultant to kind of manage the funding strategy for our region and think about how do we pull folks together. But we think this is something that someone needs to wake up every day and be thinking about for the next, let's say, 6 to 12 months.
Thank you. Sharon.
I think we're doing a a lot of the same things that Aaron has been doing. For us, however, it's also because we're so heavy on community-based organizations that represent our communities, we're letting them know what some of this is, and we're asking them to be part of the interaction with the federal government, the state government, and local decision makers. What happens with our communities is that there's a lot of people talking for them and not necessarily bringing them to the table. So we are trying to act as sort of the gate breakers and having our community-based organizations send those letters to the FCC about the EBB. Also, I've never used so many acronyms in my life. So I know that you all probably do the same. And do the same thing with like state agencies and stuff. So we're trying to, the soil that we're tilling is the soil within our community-based organizations that are on the ground already.
Great. Kurt, and then Colin.
Very similarly, we're making sure that all the organizations that are involved in our coalition are aware of just what's out there, because as Aaron said, there's so much. There's so many different programs that sometimes the dollars are controlled through the government. Sometimes it's through the schools, libraries. The EBB is it really touches the individual. So just making sure that the education is there and people are aware. But then also I think our conversations over the last year or so have really prepared us for this. Whether it's just everybody talking together and seeing, all right, what do we need? What are the gaps in our systems? And what solutions can we implement to do this? So we've been talking about a digital navigator approach, which I know the webinar last week touched on that topic, but we've been talking about a digital navigator approach and haven't necessarily had the full dollars to support that. So whether it's that or another solution, something like that the coalition has worked around to develop, but making sure that the priorities of the practitioners and the coalition are heard when addressing those who control the flow of money in our region that's coming.
Great.
And I can just add that, so as the federal government is preparing to hopefully make this money available or to continue to make the money available, that we're also having federal investments in research to document what's going on. And unfortunately, this is oftentimes, these are things that are not invested in, but I think that there's a real opportunity with agencies like the National Science Foundation and other agencies and for IMLS as one of the examples that we've heard already, it's been a wonderful organization that is focused on museums and libraries and focused on their role and investing in research. Obviously, as from a research perspective, we want to also see that there's investment in research to document the successes and the challenges during this time. And I really think that there's a real opportunity to do that. But I think that's still a question ahead in terms of whether there will be priority on investments in research to document. And I should also say investments in qualitative research too. We need community studies. We need, not just broad surveys with important, statistical analysis to understand these huge investments. Incredibly important to do that. But at the same time, we also need to invest in community-based research that really does, bring out what the stories that are happening in communities across the country at this time with this really unprecedented investment that we're seeing.
Great, thank you. So I know we're almost at the hour. There'll be people who have to jump, but we'll keep going and let's try to get through all the questions that are in the chat. Maybe let's start with a really simple one for you, Aaron. Would you be willing to share the intake form that you referenced for people joining your coalition?
Yeah, it's actually, the link is posted in the chat. So Perfect. Feel free to look. I will give the caveat that is for people interested in joining the Franklin County Coalition. You need to live in Franklin County. So please use it as a reference, but we don't necessarily want to be receiving nationwide inquiries.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm going to go to one more follow-up for you, Aaron, while I have you. We have a question from Jay. He's asking, how often are your counterpart organizations across the country, regional councils, COGs, et cetera, taking a similarly active role in convening these conversations? Are you kind of alone in this, or is this a model that other people could look to?
We are definitely not alone, but it is, I think, similarly evolving work for a lot of our colleagues across the country. It's important to note that regional councils are really diverse in the services that they provide and even the ways that they're structured across the country. So there are just some differences in capacity, but it's relatively new work for a lot of regional councils. We joined a panel with our colleagues in San Diego to present to the National Association of Regional Councils at their annual conference a couple months ago to kind of talk about our work in developing the Digital Equity Coalition here in Franklin County in Central Ohio. In San Diego, they are doing very deep work. Los Angeles as well. So there are examples out there. I know our colleagues in Boston are very interested, but are kind of just beginning that work, and similar in Detroit. So it kind of depends on a case-by-case basis, but there's broad interest in getting involved. So I would definitely encourage you all to reach out to those folks as partners and potential resources.
Great. So Colin, Kurt, Aaron, again, if you want, that we have a question, which kind of goes back to what we discussed on membership, but let's go a little bit deeper, which is, how are you in practice, or how have you seen for you, Colin, in practice, organizations negotiating, or coalitions rather, negotiating, leaving out certain members, right? So, how are you, I guess I'm intuiting some of this from the question, but how do you have that conversation, or how do you communicate that you're not going to be engaging with certain organizations, I guess like ISPs, because they're not aligned with the mission? Just sort of walk us through how you're doing that, if you are.
So I can just jump in very briefly. It's not going to be very, very helpful, but what I could say from my experience, visiting cities across the country back in 2015 for the 2016 report, is I did have an opportunity to go to a few coalition meetings. And I actually saw sort of what Kurt was saying, is that, I think, Kurt, you mentioned it's a sort of a big tent, rather than, making specific decisions about who's in. It's certainly something I think with my future research, looking at digital equity ecosystems, that I'll be really interested to look at. But for example, I think I've been in meetings where all of the ISPs have been in the room, right? With all of the representatives from different organizations. And, that creates for a very interesting dynamic. So, but generally speaking, I think it is important to, include folks, the more organizations that can be at the table, the better. But again, I'm sorry that I don't have a better answer related to, how to make specific decisions about, who is involved and who's not involved.
And I won't be as helpful either, because we do include everybody as well. But I can say that when we do have corporations or people representing corporations or ISPs, we make sure that they know that this isn't just a marketing opportunity, that if they do want to be involved, that it's helping to develop solutions. This isn't, it's not PR. It's really getting in and doing the work. That's all I'll say about that right now.
Thanks.
And I want to make sure to clarify that I think I maybe gave the impression that our coalition is relatively exclusive, or that we are heavily vetting folks, and I don't want to give that impression at all. Really, essentially, if there's any organization that reaches out, we have not turned away an organization yet from being a part of the coalition. It's more saying to the steering committee members, heads up, this group said that they want to be a part. That includes corporate partners that are not ISPs. And we even have a way for individuals to engage with our various working groups, just not joining the overall coalition. The one piece with ISPs where the conversation is really focused is, at some point, if they do join the coalition, we as a steering committee and as a coalition want to make sure that they are coming in the right frame of mind, and make sure that they are bringing what we would want them to bring to the table. So we've actually talked about, do we have some certain asks that we would request of the ISPs in order to join the coalition, like sharing data on their discount broadband programs, as a way to not just kind of show that they have skin in the game, but we have very specific strategies and goals around reaching low-income individuals, and we just don't know. The data isn't out there. None of us have as much data as we would like about who is being underserved and what the uptake of certain programs and opportunities is. So that's a very real goal that we have, is to get better data. And so that's something that the ISPs could say we can contribute to that knowledge base. And that would kind of be one way that they could kind of contribute in line with what the coalition's trying to achieve. So like I said before, those are ongoing conversations, but those are the kind of signals for the right type of engagement that we may be looking for as we think about engaging with them.
Great, thank you. And Sharon, did you want to weigh in? Do you have ISPs as part of your coalition? Or do you have any hard and fast rules about organizations that aren't allowed to join?
Because we actually center undoing institutionalized racism, organizations sort of self-select out. Naturally, because the conversation around capitalism and institutionalized racism and the binary thinking of poor versus oligarchy doesn't really, it's a very hard conversation to navigate, and a lot of ISPs don't necessarily want to. I think we have had private conversations with ISPs and small community providers who understand that the better conversations we've been having have been with small community providers. They're the folks that see their clients and their customers at the supermarket. They're related to them for some parts. I think those are the folks that we've had better luck with, and those are the folks that we want to elevate. Xfinity doesn't need us to elevate what they. We're gonna yell at them because their Internet Essentials is not a great program, and they were asking for social security numbers in the first 90 days. Like we were bringing up a lot of issues that were causing unnecessary hurdles to our communities, especially migrant and undocumented communities. So they're always welcome at the table, but we are very clear that the role of the ISP is not to guide where the conversation goes. That comes from our community-based organizations. And I just want to take 2 seconds to answer one of the questions about community members being involved. For our organization, because our community-based organization leadership is involved, so we're talking about small organizations that are they're nonprofits, or they're the mom and pop community-based organizations that just get together to solve a localized problem. Those are the folks that we have at the table. They make up about 70% of our steering committee. So they're the folks that see our families on a daily basis. They're the folks that were handing out food boxes during the whole pandemic. They're the folks that are they're the folks that talk to us first about digital navigators and how their staff are being digital navigators without any training, and that they needed the training and they needed the support. They're the folks that are trusted advocates for our communities. So that's how we've started engaging community members, is having them come to us and let us know how it is that we best serve them. So I thank you for that, for allowing me to answer that question.
Absolutely. And why don't we stay on that? And we can kind of tie 2 questions together that were in the chat, which is one about, which was earlier about, do the others allow community members? And I would take that to mean in their individual capacity to be part of the coalition. And then let's also tie it together with this question around, is anyone engaging in listening sessions or other very disciplined and specific, what we would call community engagement methodologies to bring community members into the coalition?
I'll tackle the second part of that. For our coalition, one of the best use case or best practices is that we can kind of raise up is the Columbus Foundation has a staff person who is her role is solely focused on human-centered design and engaging with the community around a host of issues. Understandably, recently she's spending a lot of time on digital equity and broadband. but they regularly convene community members in very small cohorts to dig really deep into certain issues. So in terms of talking about broadband access, trying to understand where there is access, why are people not, is it strictly a financial challenge, or are there other challenges to why people are not adopting broadband, and trying to go really deep with a small number of folks to better understand that. One of our other coalition member organizations is called Pact. It's called Partners Achieving Community Together. So they're a neighborhood-based group in one inner city neighborhood. The plan is to expand out to other neighborhood groups. They just happen to have more capacity in this space. But they have been doing surveys of their residents in the neighborhood on a door-to-door scale around broadband since the pandemic started, and are working very closely with some of the other members around kind of building out new pilots for providing low-cost options. So there are certain components of the coalition that are really diving deep into the grassroots engagement. And then we're kind of using that as a model to understand how can we scale that to the rest of Central Ohio also.
Thank you. Kurt, Colin?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer. We do have some community members involved, not a lot, just again, because of the voluntary capacity. But we have a lot of really small community-based organizations who speak a lot for the people that they serve every day. And we encourage them to continue to ask, to continue to bring up the needs that they're hearing all the time, so they're front and center of all of especially the committee conversations. We haven't done any listening sessions. We spoke with who Aaron was talking about before, and would love to kind of bring that to Cleveland, that kind of thing, because it's fascinating what she's doing, and what she's learning, especially. So
Thanks. Colin, anything to add?
I think that the only thing that I'll add is really, it's more because I've looked at it more at an organizational level, really looking at those, the champions within the communities, right? So many nonprofit organizations have, the volunteers, or just the stars kind of in their community that volunteer their time, their energy, and oftentimes, those are the folks that, can get brought in to be kind of either leaders within coalitions or, representatives of the organizations. But I think what you're asking, Amalia, is really important to say, how might coalitions look in a more structured way towards organizing members of communities to play important roles in coalitions moving forward? And I think that's a really great question.
Great, thanks. So I'll get to you in just a second, Sharon. So I want to do a shout out to all the researchers in the chat. We don't want you to think we didn't see you. You're doing important work. So this is sort of an invitation to the panelists and also anyone who's watching. If you are open and willing to talk to someone who's doing research around digital equity planning, coalitions, community-based work, et cetera, I'll just invite you to put your email address and name in the chat so that our researchers who are out there can harvest the good contacts in the chat, and we can feel like we're supporting them. I want to go back to Aaron and then to you, Sharon. So Aaron, there was one question earlier in the chat around the funding index structure for money that's moving. And I don't know if you feel equipped to answer that or not, but I thought I'd toss it to you.
Yeah, so I will be happy to share that once it is a little more fleshed out. We're trying to make it a little more usable for our own purposes. And then once we have that matrix put together, be happy to share through NDIA out to everyone also.
Great. Sharon, back to you.
I think one of the things that I want to drive home around the community-based engagement is that, as you pointed out, Amalia, there is billions of dollars that's coming down, and some of that money will be available for support of the work that we're all doing. I would really want I really want to push all of us to consider writing in an equitable budget request to have community-based members be paid for work. I have my implicit bias at the beginning of the pandemic was that our community-based members were going to be too busy, didn't want to do the work for free, were not going to be interested in something as incredibly exciting and enticing as broadband speeds. And the reality is that my communities, all of them, basically slapped me around and were like, you can't make that decision for us. So we found money to pay them. We found money to help subsidize their time. The reality is that they're already doing this work. We just don't know about it, right? They're already being digital navigators. They're already doing the phone calls to Comcast, Xfinity, Cox, whatever internet provider you have. They're already on the phone with their families making those phone calls. And I would really push us to not make the assumption that community-based organizations and community people are not interested in being part of this conversation. It's just that we never asked them. So with all this money that's coming down, again, I implore you, as you're making the suggestions to get funding, as you're looking to who gets funded from what, as you're talking to state agencies, state legislators, the federal government, there is enough money out there to really pay our community members to be a part of this conversation, or else, again, we're going to be doing it for as opposed to with.
Excellent. So there's two more questions in the chat that I'm going to pull forward, and then we'll move to close. And I'm really highlighting these because I think it's an exercise for all of us right now in real time to try to show how we bring two things together to share a space that we might not have initially conceived of. So one of the questions comes from Larry, which I think is excellent, which is, how are programs like Digital Navigators, how are they recognizing and building on community models that have long been in existence? For example, in the Latinx community, many of us know about and have interacted with the promotora model for health delivery. So, how are you guys seeing from your vantage points ways that people are building on community excellence that's already out there? And then we'll go to the second question.
Can I answer that first? Do you all
Please.
mind? So we submitted a proposal to the governor's office, so Governor Inslee here in Washington State, and one of the things that we did was we included paying community-based organizations who are already doing that and are trusted advocates within our communities. Again, like I said, they're already doing the work. They're already being digital navigators without necessarily the title. So for us, and one of the reasons that came up was because we had a Latinx organization here that has a similar program like Promotoras, and was just like, look, my community is already calling, my community is already talking about it, my community, but my families, my folks, my staff don't necessarily know a lot of what they're talking about. They have the snippets of facts. So one of the things that we wanted to do was build their skill sets around becoming digital navigators as well as promotoras, right? So that they can do both and triage our families as they're having those conversations. So for example, Amalia, if I were to call you and be like, hey, I don't have any food, I need some support, I don't have any internet, I don't know how to get unemployment, that would be a trigger for you. And we would have already provided the digital navigating training for you to know how to resource all of those questions and process through. As well, we started a multilingual, multicultural tech call-in center for our families that can call in. And there's currently 8 different languages being spoken. We're going to onboard 5 other languages here in a couple of months, with the idea that, Amalia, let's say you, again, I'm using you as a digital navigator situation. If you were a promotora and you got a question that you just didn't understand, you could call the tech call center and on a 3-way call with your family, be like, hey, I have a family, they have the blue screen of death, we don't know what's going on. And you would then also be on the call as the tech center is processing that question through, so that their family also not only has a trusted advocate with you on the line, but there's also a warm handoff to the call-in center. I think it's really important for us to recognize that we have so many trusted advocates And they're looking for more skill sets. We know there is not a single job in this country now that doesn't need some kind of digital support, digital work, digital understanding, digital knowledge. And it is our opportunity. One of our state representatives called this our FDR moment. It really is our opportunity to offer these kinds of trainings and skill sets to folks who would never have had this opportunity and actually maybe get out of the recession thriving.
Great. Anyone else want to weigh on this? No? Okay. So here's the last question, and then I'm going to pass it back to you, Angela. So this one is a stretch, but I think that this is exactly the place. It's a great place to leave this conversation because I think it tees up the work that we all still have to do. So there was a question earlier in the chat around what is the intersection, or what are the ways that we can connect the energy, the passion, the drive, and the call for justice around policing and police accountability to digital equity. And so I'm just going to put that out to all of you as we close, right? What are the opportunities for all of us to start thinking things through together, right? Is it around curriculum? Is it around new relationships and bringing communities in? Is there a space in your coalition for that, or should there be? Colin, will you kick us off?
Sure, absolutely. So one thing that I can contribute to this conversation is work that Angela Seifer and I did to look at how do we evaluate the success of digital inclusion programs. We might extend that to coalitions. And one of the things that we were trying to put forward in the report that we did back in 2017 was to say, let's look at what are the outcomes, the social end goals, the outcomes of the work that actually have nothing to do with technology, right? So if we start there in our work together, we have an opportunity to be inclusive of the types of concerns that we're talking about here. We're about the racial justice concerns, about environmental concerns, but thinking about if we're talking about the challenges of policing in communities and what's happening, we can say, well, that should be a part of it, right? That should be a part of our goal towards creating healthier communities, whatever the definition or the way that the community is defining it. That allows for an ability to be expansive and inclusive of the type of work that's happening in our communities that are often also disproportionately affected by a lack of broadband access. So I think that, well, again, I think it's been great to hear from Sharon and your work and how your community is focused on this, that it's central. I think for folks where that's not their starting point, it certainly should be, and it can be, especially if we sort of look at those outcomes and we start there. What is the vision for our community long-term? How do we get there? And how does digital equity, how is it a piece of it, right? It's a piece of it alongside other work. And so I think that's a really helpful starting point.
Great. Kurt, Aaron, any last words?
It is certainly a raw topic, even more so in the past day in Columbus. So right before the decision in Minnesota, like minutes before, there was a 15-year-old girl that was killed by police here in Columbus. So understandably, I think people are trying to figure out how to process that more broadly, not just, just contextualize in general. I definitely am not, and probably Marpsy as well, are not the right people to talk about our approach to racial equity for the coalition. But we have other coalition members, particularly the CEO of our YWCA, who really leads a lot of the equity and inclusion work in the Central Ohio area. Some of our other members are who will look to kind of guide those conversations and direct us in terms of that work. But yeah, it's a very raw subject right now.
Absolutely. Anything from you, Kurt?
I'll just say that our coalition needs to recognize that digital equity is racial equity. The same communities that have been digital redlined are the ones that are over policed. And so kind of echoing Colin, that this digital equity is just one piece of this. and that there's a broader world that we all need to be working towards and addressing as well.
Incredible conversation. Thank you all for your focus, for your work. Really great questions from everyone. I'm so glad this was recorded. I will turn it back to you, Angela.
That was awesome, as we expected. NDIA staff has a side chat in case we need to take care of problems, and one of my staff put a little fire icon up because you all were on fire. So big thanks to everyone for joining us. This has been recorded and it will be posted tomorrow. So do please share, and we will always make sure that we gather questions up and we push those out as much as we can. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Amalia for leading all of this. You all are incredible. Thank you for sharing your experience and expertise with us. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone.